Okay, so here's the super short part two of the What is Racism narrated PowerPoint. So in the last video, we talked about what race is and the components of racism, and then different expressions or forms of racism. It's important to recognize that just as much work is being done in figuring out responses to racism as there are to sort of trying to map out what racism is. In fact, if you remember in the slide about colorblind racism, one of the problems with colorblind racism is a refusal to acknowledge race or a refusal to talk about it actually doesn't make it go away. It just blinds us to structural and institutional and cultural phenomenon that we know are damaging to all people. And the challenge of racial justice work or anti-racism work is to acknowledge just how harmful racism is to everybody, that it creates a painful lack of belonging or separation among all people, and that it really works to sustain all sorts of racial injustices. In fact, if we were to think back to the problem tree exercise, we would recognize that racism and that even white supremacy is feeding the roots of many of the social problems in our society. So let me just say something very quickly, and again, could spend an entire semester just thinking about this question. But I think there's something important to be said about the difference between being non-racist and being anti-racist. So non-racism or an attempt to not be racist really reduces racial justice to a very individual lens or an individual response. Tends to think almost in the way that seeing direct service or charity as a response to injustice. Individual people claiming that they're not racist or refraining, from acts of interpersonal racism, while very important and really good, is insufficient, and largely insufficient because we saw that interpersonal racism, and let me bring you back to that slide, interpersonal racism, common sense racism, is actually a very small or a very insignificant, I shouldn't say insignificant, but it's just one piece of thinking about racism, and in fact really misses the structural, the cultural, the institutional dimensions. So while individuals and good intending individuals can say, well, I'm not racist, and refrain from engaging in acts that are rooted in prejudice, those folks are all still very much a part of systems or institutions like higher education, like healthcare, like criminal justice, that we know, based on what we said about institutional racism, don't effectively serve all people well, and in fact often disadvantage groups of people based on their racial identity. And that we also know that wanting to claim to not be a racist might also be a form of colorblind racism, right? That a refusal to see race, well, again, it might be good intended as a way of avoiding racial bias or prejudice. It really doesn't galvanize people to act, to change situations, to change structures, to change institutions, to change cultures that are broken, right? That if you can't see something, you can't really fix it. Or if you're not able to name it, you can't be involved in dismantling it. So when we start to think about what anti-racism is, I think an analogy of a conveyor belt is really helpful. And again, this comes from Dr. Kamara Phyllis Jones with the CDC. And she says anti-racist work involves waking up to the fact that perhaps you're standing on a people mover, kind of like this one that's being depicted here in this airport, and you're moving in a particular direction. And maybe the direction you're moving in is an unjust direction. Maybe you are moving in a direction of institutional or cultural racism. And you could wake up to that reality. And one thing you could try to do would be to perhaps walk in the opposite direction, to say, no, I'm, as an individual, I don't want to move in this direction. I don't want to participate or be part of this system or this culture that is racist. But you're going to, as an individual, bump up against a lot of resistance because there's a ton of momentum that is already behind the people mover. There's a lot of people moving in a particular kind of direction. It might actually be really impossible to get yourself off that conveyor belt or to move in the opposite direction. Anti-racist work involves joining a group of people to perhaps try to reverse the direction of the conveyor belt. It involves kind of trying to perhaps interrupt the machinery, interrupt the workings or the mechanisms, trying to take apart the engine perhaps, trying to put something else together that could move all of the people who are on that conveyor belt in a different direction. And it's really work that's that kind of work, that dismantling work is in the world of anti-racist work, is being led by the people who are most directly impacted in negative ways by histories of racism or by current circumstances of racism. So this is not necessarily work that's being led by white people to be most effective in knowing what's broken and what needs to be fixed. It needs to be led by the people who are most directly impacted, but requires a broad coalition of all kinds of people in doing that work. Ibram Kendi has got a book out, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and you can see a quote there from him on what anti-racism requires. And basically it requires a real strong commitment to not thinking that any one particular person or group of people is inferior or superior based on their racial identity. So it's constantly checking ourselves and our racial biases and prejudices. But then it's about action. So it's about behaving in particular ways that underscore that commitment to the fact that no one group is inferior or superior, and to ensure, let's say, that institutions are equally serving all people, that cultures are equally celebrating all of the different people that make up that culture. So it's a very active stance, and it's an active stance that wants to get at the root cause of lots of structural injustice and lots of institutional injustice. So getting back to that idea of the conveyor belt, wanting to dismantle the conveyor belt, wanting to get at the root causes so that we can put something else in its place. Okay, so a little bit longer than I thought, but a recap that integrates some of the other ways of thinking about justice. So the question is, do we see some of the feminists that we're reading this week engaging in this anti-racist position? All right, thanks.